Can you start by telling us how you got into music in your early days and what were your early influences and how you got into the music scene?
Yeah, according to my mum, I was singing in the cot. But my mum had her cousins over from Jamaica in the 50s, when I was in the late 50s when I was born. And basically, from the day they came here, they bought old school R&B, ska music, and later on reggae, soul, and funk, and jazz. And there was always music around my house. And I think my mum said that she thought I was going to be musical, so she did send me to piano lessons. So when I was at school, I was always in the choirs. I had piano lessons, I sang also in church. So music was a big part of my life growing up, listening to it, making it, and then later on when I was a teenager, going to youth club and dancing to it.
And what was your first involvement in the Leicester scene?
I think the Leicester music scene really started for me with Papa Shifter, which was a proper reggae sound system, and through Wendy Christian I used to hang out with them and follow them, and then found the courage to just sing on the mic, and then later on I started chatting on the mic, and then they started putting me with Wendy at our clashes when we'd be battling against the sound system. So I think that would be my entry into the Leicester music scene.
What year was that?
I guess that was kind of like the early to mid 80s, I would say, mid 80s.
Okay. And when you got involved in the scene, what other artists, DJs, venues were kind of buzzing at the time?
Well, there was Culture, there was Wendy Christian, who was the first female MC that I knew in Leicester, but obviously I was influenced by Sister Nancy from Jamaica. There was, obviously I knew about Groundation as a band, but also when I was growing up I knew about Hubert, who was in sort of bands in the 60s, and he'd been on Top of the Pops. And so the music scene then for me was very much going to dance hall or going to blues, and so Groundation coming along as a reggae band was kind of pretty critical. Later on Wendy had her band, which was the last band, and we started to see bands in the 80s that were kind of doing pop jazz or jazz pop. And again, I used to go and see those kind of bands, go and see them live. And then there was also bands like The General Idea, who were doing kind of industrial techno funk at that time. I think Leicester Poly was really important because we all used to go down there and listen to bands.
Yeah. Okay, so we know you've had a very interesting journey yourself musically. Can you talk to us about your journey?
Yeah, it was really, really strange. I mean, once I started singing on the sound system, people got to hear about me, and sort of people asked me to do things like backing vocals, which is really good to get, learn your craft as a singer. So there's this band called Yeah Yeah No. They were a pop band. They were all over Melody Maker, and there was a studio called Street Music, and I was asked by a guy called Wayne, who was called Naya, to come in and do some backing vocals, and we sang on a track called Stealing in the Name of the Lord. So that's my first ever piece of vinyl that my voice is actually on, and that was positively reviewed in Melody Maker.
What year was that?
I guess that was really, really early 80s. I'm not sure, but it was certainly very early 80s when that came out. Okay. Yeah. And then I think the really big pivotal thing, the really life-changing thing was there was Formation 5 Records. There was a guy called Trevor, who was also on the Papa Shifter sound system, who used to come around my house and play me the latest pre-release techno and house music from Chicago and Detroit, and I loved it, and I used to just listen to that an awful lot. And then the next thing that happened, there was Leroy and Idris doing kind of warehouse parties, and there was a warehouse party at Spectrum, and I was asked to do a PA there, because by that time I'd already studied sound engineering at Gateway School, Kingston Polytechnic, and I'd started making my own house tracks. And at the time I did a cover of If Loving You Is Wrong. I did a PA at this warehouse event at Spectrum, but also on the bill was Boys in Shock. And Boys in Shock were Ashley Beadle and Dean Zephyrin. Dean Zephyrin's still a big DJ now in London. He's now called The Saint. And they saw me and they took me off to London, and this was my first house record that I made with them. And this is the time in the 80s when house was totally underground. It was kind of, there were people coming back from Ibiza in London doing big parties in massive warehouses along the Thames. in a place called Clink Street, and I literally went on the train from Leicester, wrote the song in the car, got to the studio and made this track. And the rest, I say, is history, because we were seen by Jamie DeCruz, who was the owner of Jack Track's label, which was really the first ever house label in the UK. This is before the Ibiza thing. And he was mainly signing Americans from Chicago. So we were kind of like that first major British house act. So, yeah.
And then how did he progress?
Well, Jamie DeCruz then decided to do a compilation album, and there's people like Blaze and Adiva and LaShandra. They're all American artists, but, you know, Give Me Back Your Love, featuring myself, was on this first ever compilation of what was then called Garage. This was before Spoonie and all those people. This was, you know, like 88, 89. And we were really pleased because all the people on here, they're kind of from New Jersey, or they're from somewhere in the States. So we were on there, and we were really thrilled by that. And obviously this made me, put me on the radar of people in America. So that was really good. So, you know, the 80s was really fertile. I mean, Leicester had a huge rave scene that was blowing up as well, and I made...
Was it house mainly you got into first then?
Yeah, I did get into house, and I also did a bit of rave, but usually I didn't use my real name, so... But yeah, there was... I think there was two things. I mean, there was... The 80s were really interesting because, you know, if I show you a photograph, I was also involved in promoting the Jazz Warriors in Leicester. So at the same time in the 80s, you've got the sort of acid jazz kind of thing going on. But at the same time, house was a really big thing. And I remember at the time, a lot of people thought that house wouldn't stick around. But I knew then that house was going to be a big thing, and I still love house now. So as we know, the rest of the story is it was a big global phenomenon, and it still is a global phenomenon. So yeah.
So you worked with quite a few different Leicester people as well, haven't you?
Yeah, sure. I mean, if I just go through here, I mean, someone like Kim De Silva is really, really important, because he was DJing with another guy at a big Leicester club called Bliss, and Bliss was really, really successful. It was in the old Street Life. And, you know, I can't talk really about Leicester musicians without mentioning Spider, because there's Spider, and there was also John Barrett. It's good to just talk a little bit about my development as a singer-songwriter, because that's absolutely critical. And for me, I think I was very lucky, because, you know, people like Spider and also John Barrett were close friends, and we were like the Three Musketeers. We kind of went everywhere and did everything together, and the bond that kept us together was we were both into soul. All three of us were into soul and jazz and funk music, and we were just vibing off each other all the time, singing at each other and coming out with ideas for songs, and, you know, all talking about music day in, day out, living, breathing music, eating together, living together. So I think that was a big thing that helped me develop as a singer, and of course John was the first person to get a deal. So that kind of put the pressure on the rest of us to get our act together. But we all kind of had that dream, because you have to remember the 80s, there was a lot of unemployment, and it was like, you know, this was a big dream to sort of make music and get on a record label, and, you know, it really fueled us. We were very passionate about it. But I think what was happening as well in the 80s is, like I said, there was kind of acid jazz scene that was going on, but there was, you know, really building up a head of steam, the whole sort of house, techno,
late 80s
music. Yeah, this is late 80s going into, I would say, the early 90s and stuff like that. And, you know, we give house a French touch. I mean, we were having people like Laurent Garnier coming from France. So there was a real internationalism. And of course, people like, I have to say this, people like Leroy was very pivotal, because Leroy played at the Cooler. He was playing hip hop initially, but then he started moving into house music. So I remember jacking my body at the Cooler and thinking, this is cool now, I can hear house music in a club, whereas I first heard it at home, you know. And then he kind of moved through that into drum and bass, and you know, the rest is history there. So I would say someone like Leroy is very, very critical in terms of the Leicester scene, in terms of music. But as I say, with things like Kim De Silva and Bliss, we were having some really good things going on. And also promoters, you've got to mention the promoters. I mean, this is me at Splendid, not wearing an awful lot, which people still talk about, particularly guys. But Splendid also was a club that was known for really good, more deep, funky house, vocal house, and people used to kind of dress up for it. But, you know, people would come out of town to come to this Leicester club, and it was like a London club, and they would have live PAs. So it wasn't just DJs, you would have live PAs as well and stuff like that, so it was really good. And I think the other thing Leicester benefited from was the fact that we were near to Renaissance. Renaissance was the club in the middle of the country that rivaled London and Manchester. Everybody came from all over the country to go to Renaissance. But of course, what made Renaissance so great was it had a fantastic sound system. You know, it was really, really incredible. So, you know, my journey's been very rich. And of course, when you get a high profile in this country, then the next logical thing is to go to America, because, you know, if you're selling records over there, as I say, people first heard about me when I was on Jack Tracks, but later on they got to hear So Damn Tough. You know, I did some work with Mark Moore, S Express. But when I was with So Damn Tough, which was, I have to mention, DJ Sasha got me this deal because he really liked the track. It got signed to an independent dance label, and we were called So Damn Tough. And then from that, we ended up on East West. So once you end up on a major, Warner Brothers, you start to get more of a profile in America, which led to me going to America later on. But I was still making lots of music with other people. There's a guy called Cordial. I made a record with him, which is on 3 Beat Records. And then every now and again I do a cheesy rave track, but I wouldn't use my name because I didn't want to confuse people, because I was more known.
What did you call yourself?
Kaio, usually, which is Japanese from the Lotus Sutra for sound. So, you know, but this is actually a hip-hop track, so making the point about, you know, still doing hip-hop. I actually produced this track and did some vocals, and they were called FUQ MCs, and they were from somewhere like Hinckley. And, you know, so our local music scene was really, really healthy. And, you know, back to my soul funk influences, some friends of mine called The Influence, who were really, really groovy group that was on Warner Brothers. I did some singing with them, some BVs for them. So, you know, even though you're doing house, you know, you're still listening to soul, you're still listening to funk, there's the whole soul to soul thing, all of that. Another track that did really well, went on Top of the Pops and everything, was I did some BVs on Outstanding, the Kenny Thomas track. So even though I was doing house, I was still staying true to my roots of soul and funk and stuff like that. So, you know.
So as you went through the 90s and stuff, did your music taste change, or
well, I think I'd always, from day one, been interested in different styles of music. So although I was kind of doing house, I would always do other projects with other people. So this is a good example. I did a project with the Capoeira Tins. One of the DJs, Alfonso's from Leicester, but they run a kind of funk night called Stomp Juice in Wolverhampton. And we did a version of Nina Simone song. But you would call it kind of funky trip-hop, kind of propeller heads style music. So yeah, I was always interested in doing projects. I always used to say to people who sent me music, if I like the sound of it, I'll work on it. If I'm not feeling it, I won't work on it. It's like, you know, I can't sort of put myself into it.
So it wasn't really about the genre, it was just about if you felt the music, so it could be any genre.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. I think they were right when they said I was musically promiscuous. Yeah. It's whether I feel something, that's the most important thing. But I do have an inner geek. I do like electronic sounds, which is why I studied, you know, how to program them and stuff like that. So making house music, you do spend a lot of time in the studio programming, and then later on I got a programmer so I could just concentrate on playing on the keyboard.
So you've obviously performed locally. Where else do you perform, like nationally?
Well, you know, obviously I performed at local clubs here, Splendid and so forth, and one of my highlights I think is performing at Renaissance, but of course you can't say you've arrived unless you've done Ministry of Sound. And I did Ministry of Sound, and you know, here's another one of me at Ministry of Sound. But the thing about Ministry of Sound, it does have, like Renaissance, a totally excellent sound system. So if you spend a lot of time programming a house track and you hear it in a place like that, it's almost like a religious experience when you feel the sound. And I really, really enjoyed playing venues like that. But equally, you know, I went to New York and I went to the Sound Factory, I went to the Tunnel, I played some, you know, the Limelight, which was a fantastic, here's a picture of Limelight. You know, these are big venues, and what I noticed in America is that they use JBL and they use really top quality sound systems, so the music just sounds absolutely fantastic. So I was really fortunate because I had a #1 with Joy. When I was on Champion Records with Stax, I basically was based in the States for 2 years, touring the whole of America, and I did some dates in Canada. And of course, the beautiful thing about that is you get to ride around in your own limos and stuff. So I was totally introduced to the American way of how they do music. But for me, I was excited because I got to go to all the places where black music originates from, and I got to meet some of my idols. You know, I got to meet people like Chaka Khan and Jeannie Tracy and all these really big divas, and they kind of took me under their wing and they gave me a lot of advice and they helped me with stagecraft, like always make sure you got beautiful shoes on because the audience is at eye level, and they gave me some really good tips and advice and stuff like that. So it felt really good to be kind of accepted by them. And they recognised me as a diva as well, so that was really nice.
Good. And how did you find like the Leicester scene over the 80s into the 90s? How did you see it changing?
I think it changed as it would with anywhere else. I mean, I think there was the whole sort of acid jazz funky scene was going on, and then it got blown apart because Stock Aitken and Waterman did a white label called Roadblack, and everyone thought it was a rare groove, and it wasn't. It was made by Stock Aitken and Waterman. So that whole thing where London was just kind of playing that got blew apart, and then house kind of rushed in, and house just grew and grew and grew and grew and grew and grew, and it, you know, it just got massive. And, you know, we kind of know the story. It was about clubs, it was about promoters, it was about, you know, we had the moral panic about, you know, big raves in fields and the whole thing. But I take a slightly different view in that I think there's a story to be told about the people actually making the music. I don't think there's been a lot of books about DJs and the promoters and so forth, and that was all good. But I don't think there's enough about you know, the people, the artists who sang, Jamie Principle, Liz Torres, some of the early people who actually sang and wrote the songs and made the music. I don't think that story's been told. But I think when we move into the 90s, it gets even bigger because then it goes mainstream. Then it starts coming on top of the pops. Then we had the chart show, we had the Big Breakfast. You know, even I went on the Big Breakfast. So, you know, and then I suppose in my own journey, when I know it's gone completely mainstream, is when, you know, I release a track on Stress label, which I did with John Digweed and Nick Muir, their Bedrock, which was a track for What You Dream Of. I mean, I expected it to sell, you know, in the dance charts, and I kind of expected that was going to be it, and that's what happened. Except later on in the 90s, it got picked up by Danny Boyle, and he used it in one of the biggest ever British films, which is Trainspotting, and so that track went even further afield. So I think that's when we can say in the 90s things went very, very mainstream.
Yeah, yeah. In terms of artists from Leicester, who would you say were the major people that have come out of Leicester over the last 20, 30 years?
That's a hard question to answer. I think on a personal level, I think someone like Lisa Millett, who kind of went into house music when I was kind of coming out of it, and she writes music as well as sings, and I just feel so proud because obviously, you know, wherever I've been in the world, I've said I'm from Leicester, and I know that some years back I performed in Moscow, and the promoter there says, oh, we've got someone else coming from Leicester, and I knew who it was. It had to be Lisa Millett. That feels really good, to go abroad and know that there's another Leicester person. But I'd have to say the other person would be Leroy. Leroy's impact is huge, locally, regionally, nationally, and internationally. And you know, you can't really measure that. I think some of the other people who I think are worth mentioning as well, people like Loretta Graham. I mean, you have to understand, when I was in Highfields, I didn't know anyone who had a record deal who was in a band who was a black woman, and she was the only one at that time. So I think someone like Loretta Graham is really, really important. But I think we've got a lot of really interesting people coming up. You know, we've got Candice Dixon coming up. You know, there's other singers that I think are coming up. But I think what Leicester's really, really good in terms of the music scene is that we've had these incredible musicians like Stan the Man and Tony Luby and other people who kind of do music week in, week out. And there might not be a discography, or there might not be the column inches press, but their musical excellence, you know, has been sustained really over decades. And I think the people that they've played with, whether it was Laurel Aitken or whoever, they've played with a lot of great people, and they've innovated also in the music scene. And quite frankly, some of us have benefited from their musical input.
I know you've got quite a few more records that we're quite keen to have a look.
Would you like to have a look? Well, this is Stress, the people behind Mix Mag magazine, and of course this is Bedrock featuring Kayo. As I explained before, Kayo was another name that I use because this is what's called progressive house. So again, it shows you that I'm interested in other types of house, but I didn't want to confuse the market. And this was a huge track, and that's quite a rare piece of vinyl there, folks, you know, full-on Renaissance mix. So you know, Stress Records, but this was actually the commercial release. So as you can see, you've got the lead character from the Train Spotting film there, and it says, Diane was right, music had changed. And I think that's a quote about the fact that by the 90s, house music was the music at that time. This is an interesting one. This was a band called the English Boys, well, the album's called the English Boys on the Love Ranch. They're a band called If, and I think they're kind of fusing pop and rock and house, and very much a hybrid. They were on MCA Records, and the leader of that band, Sean McCluskey, was also one of the biggest house promoters going in the land, and he decided to, and they were very much encapsulating the whole Ibiza vibe, you know, the sort of laid-back Ibiza vibe. This one is one of my favourites. It's called Falling, and I did that with Joey Masafia, who's actually a British DJ who had his own label called Ulterior Records. Now, this is actually the deep house mix, but this actual song went on to be a big hit in the emerging what I call second wave garage, you know, with Spoonie D and all those guys, you know, in London. And so what's more famous, if you go on YouTube, is the actual garage mixes of this track. So this one's quite rare. This is the one I prefer, which is the deep house mix. But again, just to emphasise, music was changing again. So as we got towards the end of the 90s, it was all that other kind of garage, wasn't it, that was coming in. I think Rosie Gaines' track Closer Than Close kind of is a good example of that. She's a good mate, by the way. Big fan of Rosie Gaines. Now, this was a track that I did with a group called High Society, and the co-producer on this was a guy, he was Aaron Friedman. He was part of Nomad. He used to work with Sharon D. Clark. So that's quite... And this is the one that did #1 in America, which is called Joy. It was just huge in America. And that's basically on the strength of that record. You know, I was able to tour all around America and all over Europe, really, all over the world. This is just a bit of rare vinyl. This is the Bedrock featuring Kyra track. But that's what, I think there was a lot of that going on, you know. There was so much activity then about seducing DJs with different mixes and different coloured vinyl and limited editions and stuff like that. So, yeah, there's some of the tracks. Just to show you this one, this is just... Compilations got big in the 90s. So this is a compilation on Esoteric, which was the track Won't Go to Heaven. And Won't Go to Heaven was a track that I did on the Azuli label, which was quite a well-known label. But of course, I did a lot of records on Champion. So just show you those labels there. Azuli Records was a really cool record shop in London. And this is more recent. This is in the last 5-6 years. A label called Soul Purpose that's run by a DJ called Tom Gianelli. So house is still going on, folks. There's still, you know, Ibiza, there's still places around the world that are having big house clubs, and there's still a big market. And it's just that people get their music now from the internet. So, you know, there are still some DJs who want to play vinyl, but we're really talking about CDJs now and playing directly from the internet. And the music has changed. You know, the music has changed as well. But more importantly, the way people receive music has changed. So I think there's more opportunities for people to just make the music they want, and there's not all the pluggers and the, you know, promoters and everything else that's in the middle.
What are you involved in currently? Any other areas of music?
Yeah, sure. I think now that I'm not sort of on a record label, sort of, you know, when I came out of the sort of house music industry end of things, kind of towards the end of the 90s, basically since I've been in Leicester in the noughties, so to speak, I've been involved with artists and different types of arts, and I was very much busy with that, but I've always managed to keep my hand in with a bit of music. So over the years, what's happened is I've now got a band called the Random Acts of Senseless Beauty, and what I'm doing there is I'm doing I'm actually playing house live, but I'm also doing funk and jazz fusions with world music. So that kind of puts into one bag all the things that I kind of like. And I'm working with really, really good live musicians, because part of me has gone back to the live music. Also, during the noughties, I've actually composed and with a friend of mine, Tony Kofi, a 18-piece ensemble. I've conducted and composed African jazz music, because I'm really big on world music, and that was using local musicians doing a series of workshops. I really enjoyed that, and we also had vocalists. I think we had 5 vocalists as part of that music ensemble. So my next project, which I hope will be part of City of Culture, gets even bigger. I want to work with an orchestra. I want to work with an urban dance electronic ensemble, and I want to work with a really huge combined choir. So because I think there's a lot to celebrate about urban, you know, black music of black origin in Leicester, but also instead of using a keyboard, we can use an orchestra, and we've got a strong choir community. We could do something really, really exciting, and because I've done a Millennium Commission as a composer before and conducted an 18-piece ensemble, I feel confident to do that. And obviously I will have some amazing collaborators, and I hope I can get people like Leroy and other people involved, and DJs, as you know, because I think that's going to be cutting edge. One of the things I've always said, when I was coming up, there was Wendy and there was Loretta Graham, and they were both kind of in reggae singers that I could say, in my community, these women are doing music, and they were singers. One of the things that I realised fairly early on, there wasn't women who were programming or writing or directing the music. And I think from fairly early on, as I explained when I got the PA gig at Spectrum, I wrote my own material, produced it and presented it and performed it. So I think from day one I've wanted to be a woman in the music industry that had a clear idea about artistic control. But also when I go in a studio, I know what to say to an engineer and to give some advice and guidance. And I think that's really important. And I think it is still very difficult for women in a very male-dominated industry. My own daughter was Leicester's first, you know, rap MC, and these things don't happen overnight. And you know, I was a reggae MC, and Wendy was. I don't see any other many female MCs today in Leicester, so that's still something I feel that needs to be addressed. And I think also as a black woman, you're stereotyped in the music industry as to what you can do and what you can, you know, how you sing and what you do and what you should be doing. So I hope for the future that we have another generation of younger women coming up who have a clear idea what they want to do. And my message to people is you don't always have to sing. You can be the programmer, you can be the engineer, you can be the promoter, you can be the agent, you can be a technician. You know, in the music industry, there's lots of different careers. It's just that you always meet people and they just want to be the performer and singer all the time. So, you know, there's other careers to be had in the music industry.
I was going to say, when did Christian released anything? Like,
not that I'm aware of. She's just made a comeback now with the band. She's playing gigs and writing new material. So you'd have to speak to her about that. But she never... See, probably it didn't come across, but it's really hard to get a deal. Still is. But it is very, very hard to get on a record, you know, or have somebody say, you know, I want you on my label. I think that's what the point I was making about Stan and all them lot is that they're incredible musicians. They've played with everyone, but they've never got a deal that I'm aware of. And that's not just recording; it's also publishing, which, you know, I've been lucky enough to be able to do. But it is a hard business. But I don't want to make it too down, you know. I don't want to make it too down.
I guess you grew up in the 70s, right?
I went to youth clubs in the 70s and then was clubbing end of 70s all through the 80s, all through the 90s. So, still clubbing. Still clubbing.
Yeah. So as you were growing up, you were talking about being a black woman, or even just generally being a woman. Forget being black and being a woman.
It's a double whammy, you know, because as a woman, regardless of your colour, there's an expectation of what you're going to do in the music industry, and then if you're a black woman, there's another overlay of what you're expected to do. So it was kind of a double whammy, and certainly nobody in my family, I wasn't really supported in having a music career. You get people in my community saying, "You got a proper job yet?" And of course, I had children and everything, so I did have to have a day job and support my children, but I never stopped pursuing my musical dreams.
So what was that then? Like, for you to go against what everybody's saying?
It is hard.
First generation.
Yeah.
Yeah? And doing all that kind of stuff, and then you got your peers who might be like, yeah, Carol, yeah, let's do this, or then some of your mates might be like, you know, you're just wasting your time.
It's just something that's either in you or it's not. As I said, there was this incredible passion that I had, but, you know, Spider had that passion, and John had that passion. I guess Leroy must have had that passion, and Idris, to follow the dream of what you want to do. But yeah, I would have to go to work. You know, I had a day job. Luckily, I was trained as a youth and community worker, and I worked in sort of professional job, and I could support myself and my children and pay for my own studio time, pay for my own sound engineering training. But it was a struggle, and I never got no support from my family. And then when I started to become successful, like people saw me on telly, on the Shark Show and all this sort of thing, people really responded to that. But equally, it was difficult when I left the industry, because people are like, well, aren't you in the industry anymore? And I was saying, no, there's lots of reasons why I'm not. Personal, family, and other reasons. My mum became ill. But I also felt that I wanted to go on a different journey as an artist. And they didn't understand that either. And people felt very ambivalent about the fact that I weren't still, you know, in the industry. That's exactly it. And but I think, you know, I've been able to, over the last 10 years, show people that there was more to me than just music. You know, I have become a writer, director, you know, working in literature and film. And more than that, I've been a talent spotter. I think the last 10 years I've been here, I've been spotting talent and helping that talent to grow, using all my experience in the music industry for everything from styling them to, you know, their singing to their music, or how you present yourself in performance. So I think I've contributed in that way, and that's what keeps me happy, that I'm making some sort of contribution. So I'm not one for just following what everybody else wants me to do.
Yeah, two more things. It just seems like, you know, from all the interviews that we've done, like Leroy and Smooth, Classic Groove, sorry, and, you know.
Yeah, Classic Groove. I met them in London at a warehouse party, and that was another situation where I went to an underground warehouse party. This is the party where I got my record deal offer from my first label. And who are the DJs? Derek and and the other guy from Classic, Paul from Classic Group, and I felt huge. I thought, yes, Leicester, you know. So that was fantastic.
So you got all this happening. You got all these guys, and they're going out and they're doing things, and it's like when they go out to different places, when you're going out to different places, like, yes, Leicester, this guy's from Leicester, this girl's from Leicester, this group's from Leicester. And that just seemed like in the 70s and 80s this was going on, early 90s.
Yes.
And then it just seemed like, from what I've heard from the storyline, someone just popped the balloon.
I think you've got to look at the whole picture. You've got to look at economics. Economics determines a lot. But I think you've got to look at where money is and where things are happening. So yeah, Leicester did have a big moment, you know, in terms of house in the 80s and 90s. But things kind of got a bit cloudy, didn't they, when New Labour came in and everything else. And I think you have to look at the bigger picture in terms of what happens, in terms of what happened with people. You know, some of these people grew up, had kids, settled down, and you know, we have the elephant in the room we haven't talked about is drugs. I never took drugs. In all my time in the music industry, I was seen as a weirdo because I didn't take drugs. And that's because I have strong spiritual beliefs and I know who I am and what I am, and that, you know, house music for me is enough. Yeah. However, that doesn't mean that I wasn't in a context where a lot of people were taking drugs, ecstasy primarily. And so you have to understand the impact of that as well. So it's kind of like the hangover. You know? And so what you've got left is those people who are still doing it, who are still doing, you know, Dean Zephyrin is still DJing, Leroy's still making music, I'm still involved with music, though not in the industry, and there was a lot of drugs in the industry. And I think that's one of the factors. You know, there's the economic situation and all of that, but people just coming of age and maybe the whole ecstasy thing as well. And, you know, those sort of things came to play. But I think where we are now is that we've got the singer-songwriter phenomenon, particularly the female, you know, in the wake of Adele and your Amy's and Emily Sands and Laura Mavulu, and, you know, you could go on. We've now got the singer-songwriter phenomenon. But the big thing that changed as well was clubs. We don't have big clubs anymore, and the whole way people are clubbing is different, and the drugs are different, and the people are different. So some of the older generation, they'd rather be in a bar listening to the classics. You know, you have all these classics and revival nights, and then you've got younger people who are listening to different music and maybe go to different clubs or are clubbing in a different way. So music always changes and things change, but some things don't change. You know, I only have one rule: it's either good music or it's bad music, and I don't care if it was made in 1944 or it was made in 2013. So that's what I think.
Cool. And finally, you touched upon this in the last you were just talking about earlier, but for you, and all this stuff was happening, you're touring, all that kind of stuff, it must have been a big decision for you, and it must, once a decision has been made, especially someone in your position, it's almost like, that's it. I'm comfortable with this, I'm confident, no matter how bold the decision is, this is what I'm going to be doing. But what is it that made you decide that I'm going to slow down or stop the mainstream industry route and family and all that kind of stuff? Were there
was a number of factors. The music industry is a complex industry, so just to highlight its complexity, I remember I was in a hotel room on my own in New York, and I was touring. Joy was massive, and a Sony executive had been schmoozing my family in New York. I had family, and he was sending limos for my auntie to go to work and taking my members of my family to expensive New York restaurants and schmoozing my whole family. And this was all lovely, and taking me to exclusive places. And then 2 weeks in, I'm on my own in the hotel room, and there's a knock on the door, and there's a contract delivered, and it's that thick. It's that thick. And when I look at it, I'm quite well educated. It talks about extraterrestrial territories. Now, that actually was unethical and unprofessional, because everybody knows in the music industry you need to have a solicitor to advise you on any contracts. But that doesn't stop major record companies doing unscrupulous things. So there was a lot of unscrupulous and unethical things that I witnessed or experienced, which led me to think, I'm kind of falling out of love with the mainstream music industry. And then there were other family circumstances. My mother developed Alzheimer's that led me to come back to Leicester. So when I came back to Leicester, it was a big irreversible decision. But when I came back here, I thought, I'm not going to sit here and twiddle my thumbs. I needed to be engaged in arts and using the experience. And for me, the bottom line was, it's music and people, or it's arts and people. And the sort of industry is another thing. I've had a great time. I've had a once in a lifetime experience. I don't regret anything. I've got wonderful golden memories, and I still make music, and I'm still happy with music. But things have changed.